This is what we're making, a setting that looks like granulation, only it's soldered. So today we're making decorative balls, granules, because they're smaller than 2 millimeters. I've been told that that's what the designation cutoff is. It doesn't matter to me because we're going to solder these on rather than use the normal granulation attaching technique. I can't be bothered. So I'm using my solder snippers to cut 1.2 millimeter wire, and I have two sizes. I have the big snippers, which are 3.26 wide, and I have the smaller ones, which are 1.8 wide. Now, I've already snipped a couple and melted them on my charcoal block, and I recommend that you get a charcoal block that you've used that has a few little depressions in it, because if you use a new block and you have a slight tilt on your bench, they'll just roll off, and we don't want that to happen. So what I want are 1.5 balls, and for that I need the small cutters. You can just use side cutters, but for something this small, it's difficult to get it really precise every time. And this, if you just rest it against the side of your snippers, which I'll show you. Yeah, so don't go all the way across, otherwise you'll just jam the metal in. But on the side, you squeeze that, it'll just drop out the bottom. And we're going to want quite a few of them, so it's quite easy to cut quite a few. Yeah, so you'll just spread these out, because if they're next to each other, they'll melt together, and we don't want that. We want them to melt separately. So just take your tweezers, spread these out so that you have a little bit of space between each one. Doesn't have to be big, but it has to be so it's not touching. Light your torch, and it doesn't matter whether you're using a mini torch or a propane torch, just a regular old flame. And what we want to do is completely cover the metal, and it'll just melt into a perfect little sphere with a slightly flat bottom where it's sitting on the charcoal. It's done. Now we'll quench these, or just let them cool, and then we'll put them in a strainer, plastic strainer, and pickle them so we'll get the oxides off. The metal I'm using for this is 19 millimeters diameter, 0.5 thick, and we're going to tin it, which I'm going to do because I'm going to sweat solder a bezel and some granules on it. So what we'll do is mix up our flux, make sure it's nice and creamy, spread it over this, put a lot of solder chips on there, hard solder, and then we're going to melt the solder, spread it with our solder pick to make sure it's completely covered. So I'm just going to slowly heat this. You can see I've got quite a bit of solder on there and flux. It's a number 7 tip, which is why it's hissing at me. So I don't want to boil all the stuff off, so relatively slowly. I need to close my door because the wind is trying to blow my flame out. We'll just bring this up to the point where the flux goes clear. And then we know that the solder is close to melting. So I use plenty of solder on this. So there, the flux is clear. The solder starts to melt, and just shift it around with your solder pick to make sure it completely covers everything. Don't melt it. Yep. So now, quench it, pickle it to get this flux off. And I've pushed it with the solder pick to make sure it doesn't stick to the charcoal block. Make your bezel to fit your stone. Normally, you'd wait to finish the outside until you've done your the majority of your work. You've soldered it to a base, but because we're going to put granules next to this, we need to tidy it up now. So just hold it in your fingers, use your 400 grade paper on your sanding stick and make it nice and pretty. Eliminate all of the solder. Make sure that it's nice and flat, and you can do that just by holding it on your finger and rubbing it on your sanding stick. Make sure when you look at it you see a dull edge all the way around. Do that top and bottom. Check that your bezel still fits your stone, it's nice and round. Flux your disc, which I placed back on my charcoal block. So a little coating of flux everywhere. We know there's solder everywhere. Place your bezel in the middle, and then we're going to take the granules that you made earlier and we're going to place them with the flat side down up against our bezel. So all the way around. It's not absolutely critical that the flat side is down, but it's a little more aesthetic if it is. So I'll just zoom in a little. So you can see that I'm placing the granules right up against the bezel. So go all the way around. Now when you're doing this type embellishment, make sure that your granules are below the edge of your bezel, otherwise you won't be able to push it over. So make sure this is in the middle, which mine isn't. We may have to add a little more flux because this is dried out. There we go. And it'll probably shift around as we're warming it up. So just push everything where it goes. If you see a couple of granules that are radically different in size, take them out and replace them, because this, you could use different granules for the effect, but for this one I want them the same size. Okay, the granules are in place, the bezel's in place, the base has solder on it, it's fluxed. So what we're going to do now is just circle this with our flame. Slowly. Keep your solder pick in your hand because you may have to nudge little bits back into place. Yeah, you see it dancing around. Once the solder starts to flow, the surface tension should pull the granules right up against the bezel. So we'll just, my flame is pretty much on the granules. Yep. And straight down I'm circling. I don't want the flame on top of the bezel because when the solder flows I want it to flow on the base. So I'm just on the base. And our flux has gone clear, and the solder should flow really shortly. So there it goes. Yep. Nice little solder line all the way around. Now shift that to make sure that it doesn't stick to the charcoal block. Quench it, have a look, make sure that solder is everywhere you want it to be. If it isn't, you can tuck a little piece of solder on the side. If this sticks to the charcoal block, don't pry it, heat it up, and shift it. If you pry it, you'll damage the block and or the metal. Take your piece out of the pickle, dry it, have a really close look, make sure that you can see a solder connecting the ball to the base or the ball to the bezel. So now we're going to make it a little more special. We're just going to flux 2 points opposite each other, and then we're going to take 3 granules and we're going to nestle them so that they make almost a point. Yeah. So we're going to do this here and just opposite. Now there should still be enough solder on this base to do what I want to do, which is solder those to the base. As you heat this up and solder it, if the solder doesn't flow onto the pieces, you can add a little piece on the side.